end with a question. Are you persuaded enough to persuade others? In other words, do you believe the message of the gospel so strongly that not only are you yourself a Christian, not only are you saved, not only have you received the message of the gospel, but that you actively try to persuade others to believe it as well and convince them that they too need to be saved? You know, the Apostle Paul said in 2 Corinthians 5:11, he said, knowing therefore the terror of the Lord, we persuade men. In other words, Paul was not just interested in his own spiritual salvation, but he was persuaded enough to persuade others. He said, we persuade men. And in this verse we see that a large part of his motivation was that he knew the fear of the Lord. The King James says the terror of the Lord. In other words, Paul understood the concept of spiritual danger. Paul recognized, rightly so, that people who have never received the gospel of Jesus Christ have not received forgiveness and a pardon for their sins through the message of Jesus Christ, that those people will lose their eternal soul. Therefore, Paul said, we persuade men. Let me give you a really fresh example of that. As we crossed Lake Victoria during the night, there was a storm. And I was persuaded enough to think about my own salvation. I got in the closet and got my own life jacket and had it nearby. But that was where it ended. I didn't try to help anybody else get their life jacket. I stayed alert. I looked at the storm through the cabin window and monitored it, and I sat on my bunk and prayed for my teammates and my fellow passengers on board. But I wasn't persuaded enough to try to persuade anybody else. But if I would have really believed that the ship was in catastrophic danger, if it would have developed a list, for instance, I would have not just been persuaded enough for myself, I would have tried to persuade others. I would have awakened my teammate, a pastor friend of mine in the bunk above, and given him his life jacket and told him there's a storm. You put this on. I would have gone out on the deck. I would have gone up and down, banging on the other cabin doors. It was the middle of the night. They were asleep. I would have banged on cabin doors and awakened people to the danger that the ship was in and tried to persuade them to put their life jackets on. But you know, I wasn't that persuaded last night. Thankfully, I didn't need to be. The ship was fine. But you know what? When it comes to the gospel of Jesus Christ, I am fully persuaded that people who don't know Jesus Christ will indeed lose their eternal souls and go to hell. And therefore, I warn people, both inside and outside the church. I actively try to convince them that I persuade them that they need to receive the pardon and the forgiveness through Jesus Christ. You know, that so many in our day have lost those deep convictions that the church once had. 2/3 of evangelicals, polls indicate, believe that people can get to heaven without Jesus. Well, you know, if your conviction is no deeper than that, you're never going to try to persuade anyone else. Now, they're persuaded enough they want to make sure they're saved. But they're not persuaded enough to persuade others. You know, and so often in the modern context, we've air-conditioned hell. If we mention it at all, we've downplayed sin. We've erased the danger of people not receiving Christ, and we have no sense of urgency. We're not persuaded enough to persuade others. But you know, it was very different for the Apostle Paul. He said in Acts 20:31, he said, remember that for 3 years I never stopped warning each of you night and day with tears. Can you imagine his deep sense of conviction, his deep sense of urgency that he can say even just to the Ephesian church, much less the rest of his ministry, just the Ephesian church? He said, I never stopped warning you for 3 years, night and day, with tears. Obviously, the Apostle Paul was persuaded enough to persuade others. So again, I pose the question, are you persuaded enough to persuade others?